to ask what the future is likely to bring, it's a reasonable stance is to try to look at the human species from the outside. So imagine you're an extraterrestrial observer is trying to take a neutral stance and figure out what's happening here. Or for that matter, imagine that you're a historian 100 years from now, assuming that there'll be any historians 100 years from now, which is not obvious. And you're looking at what's happening now, looking back at what's happening now. So either of those two stances, you'd see something quite remarkable. For the first time in the history of the human species, we have clearly developed the capacity to destroy ourselves. That's been true since 1945. It's now being finally recognized that there are more long-term processes like environmental destruction, which are leading in the same direction, maybe not total destruction, but destruction of the capacity for organized, for decent existence. So there's at least, and there are others like the danger of pandemics and so on, but there are, which have to do with globalization and interaction and so on. So there are processes underway and institutions right in place, like nuclear weapon systems, which could lead to a serious blow, maybe termination of organized existence. And then the question is, what are people doing about it? It's not a secret. It's all perfectly open. So you have to undertake an effort not to see it. And there are reactions. There's a range of reactions. There are those who are trying hard to do something about these threats. There are others who are acting to escalate the threats. And if you look at who they are, this future historian or extraterrestrial observer would see a strange situation. Those who are trying to mitigate or overcome the threats are the least developed societies, the indigenous populations, the remnants of them, tribal societies, First Nations in Canada and so on. They're not talking about nuclear war, but they're concerned with environmental disaster, and they're really trying to do something about it. In societies that have, in fact, all over the world, Australia, India, and South America, almost everywhere you look, there are battles going on. Sometimes it's wars. In India, it's a major war over destruction of direct environmental destruction, with the tribal societies trying to resist very harmful resource extraction operations, harmful locally, but also in their general consequences. So this is all over the world. And in the societies where indigenous populations have an influence, they're large and influential, they're really taking a pretty strong stance. So the strongest stand of any country with regard to global warming is in Bolivia, which has an indigenous majority of constitutional requirements for rights of nature and things like that. In Ecuador, which also has a very large indigenous population and happens to be an oil exporter, it's the only one I know where the where the government is seeking aid to help keep the oil in the ground instead of producing it and exporting it. And the ground is where it ought to be. Mm-hmm. Hugo Chavez, who just died recently, and is an object of mockery and insult and hatred throughout the Western world. He was at he attended a session of the UN General Assembly a couple of years ago, which elicited all sorts of ridicule because he called Bush a devil and so on. But he also gave a speech at the General Assembly, which was quite interesting. Of course, Venezuela is a major oil producer. The oil, it's practically their whole GDP. But he gave a speech in which he said that he warned of the dangers of overuse of fossil fuels, and urged that the producer and consumer countries get together and try to work out ways to reduce fossil fuel use. That's pretty amazing on the part of an oil producer. He's half Indian. It's got indigenous background. So that was never even reported. What was reported was funny things he did and so on. I could go into some of them, which are pretty funny. So just to give you one, I got my one and only phone call in life from the New York Times asking for a comment. What had happened was Chavez gave a talk there in which he said, they quoted him as saying that he's sorry that he came here after I died. He wanted to meet me. Everyone thought that was very funny, so articles all over the world. And they called me up. There's one slight problem with it. If you look at the transcript of what he said, it's perfectly straightforward. It's in Spanish, of course. He said that he was sorry that he hadn't been able to meet John Kenneth Galbraith before he died. Galbraith had died. Well, apparently they felt it didn't fit the image to have him wanting to see a liberal icon, so he could want to see somebody who's off on the fringes. Now, it's conceivable that the American reporters didn't understand, but it's hard to imagine that the reporter for, say, Le Monde didn't understand. Anyway, but the speech that he gave was pretty interesting, and in general, this is pretty much across the world. That's true. So at one extreme, you have indigenous, tribal, aboriginal societies trying to stem the race to disaster. Then you go to the other extreme. The richest, most powerful societies in world history, like, say, the United States and Canada, they are racing full speed ahead to try to destroy the environment as quickly as we can. They want to extract every drop of hydrocarbons from the ground as quickly as possible. Both political parties, the media, President Obama, the international press, looking forward with great enthusiasm to what they call a century of energy independence for the United States. Energy independence is almost totally meaningless, but put that aside. What they mean is we'll have a century in which we'll be able to maximize the use of fossil fuels and destroy the world as fast as possible. That's the other extreme, and that's pretty much the case all around. I mean, Europe's doing something, in fact, the United States, the richest country in the world, is the only country of maybe 100 relevant ones that doesn't even have a national policy for restricting use of fossil fuels, doesn't have renewable energy targets, and so on. It's not because the population doesn't want it. The population is pretty close to the international norm in concern about global warming. It's institutional structures that block it. Business interests don't want it, and they're overwhelmingly powerful in determining policy. So you get a big gap between opinion and policy on lots of issues. So that's what the future historian, if there is one, would see. He might also read scientific journals that you can find right now, and I won't run through the details, but every one you open has a more dire prediction than the last. The other issue is nuclear war. That's a very serious one. I mean, it's been known for a long time that if there was a first strike by a major power, even with no retaliation, it would probably destroy civilization just because of the nuclear winter, the consequences that would follow. You can read about it in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, well understood. So the danger has always been a lot worse than we thought it was. And it's been pretty serious. And we've just passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it's been called the most dangerous moment in history by Arthur Schlesinger, Kennedy's advisor, which it was. But the worst, and it came very close, not the only time, but almost the worst aspect in some way is that the lessons haven't been learned. In fact, what happened has been prettified to make it look as if acts of courage and thoughtfulness. In fact, it was almost insane. There's a point in the end of the missile crisis, was reaching a peak, when Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy and offered to settle it by a public announcement of withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and Turkish missile and U.S. missiles from Turkey. Actually, Kennedy hadn't even known they were there, and they were being withdrawn anyway because they were being replaced by more lethal Polaris submarines, which are invulnerable. So that was the offer. Kennedy and his advisors considered it and rejected it. Kennedy himself was estimating the likelihood of nuclear war at maybe a third to a half. They rejected it. They would not. He did agree to make a secret agreement that they would withdraw the missiles that they were already withdrawing, but not public. Khrushchev had to be humiliated. Kennedy had to maintain his macho image. He's praised for this. And in fact, not even mentioned, I try to find it, is that a couple of months before the crisis blew up, the United States had just sent nuclear missiles with nuclear warheads, the same kind, to Okinawa, aiming at China at a period of great regional tension. Well, who cares? We have a right to do anything we want anywhere in the world. Okay, over. The fact that there's other lessons too. No time to go into it. But 10 years after that, 1973, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert, the high-level nuclear alert. The point was to warn the Russians not to interfere in the Israel-Arab war that was going on, and in particular, not to interfere with the fact that Kissinger had informed the Israelis that they could violate the ceasefire that the U.S. and Russia had just agreed upon. So he wanted to make sure the Russians didn't disrupt this, so he called a nuclear alert. Well, nothing happened. 10 years after that, Ronald Reagan was in office. As soon as he came into office, he and his advisors had the U.S. Air Force penetrating Russian airspace to try to elicit information about Russian warning systems. So there kind of be a mock attack, Unfortunately, the Russians, they had a war scare, in fact. They might have thought this is a real first strike, but fortunately they didn't. And it goes on like that. Well, right at the moment, it's on the front pages. In the case of North Korea, case of Iran, and there are ways to deal with these crises. Maybe they won't work, but at least you can try. Not even being considered, not even being reported. If there's time, I could talk about them. So, for example, in the case of Iran, which is considered in the West the gravest threat to world peace, not elsewhere, just in the West. It's a Western obsession, but not in the Arab world, not in Asia, But is there a way to deal with it? Well, a pretty sensible way. It was just proposed a couple of months ago at the meeting of the non-aligned countries, most of the world. In fact, they were just reiterating a proposal that's been around for decades, and in fact has been approved by the General Assembly and so on. The proposal is to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Well, not the answer to everything, but a pretty significant step forward. And there are ways to proceed with that. Under UN auspices, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was to be an international conference in Finland last December, which was to try to implement plans to move towards this. Well, what happened? You won't read it in the newspapers because it wasn't reported, but what happened, you can read it in arms control journals and so on. In early November, Iran agreed to attend the meeting. A couple of days later, the U.S. canceled the meeting, saying the time wasn't right. The European Parliament issued a statement calling for it to continue. The Arab states said they would continue, but nothing. So we'll move on towards harsher sanctions against the population. Doesn't hurt the regime, and maybe war. Who knows what will happen. And Northeast Asia is kind of the same sort of thing. North Korea may be the craziest country in the world. It's certainly a good competitor, but it does make sense to try to figure out what's in the minds of people if they're acting crazy. So why would they behave the way they're behaving? Well, just imagine ourselves in their position. Let's take, say, Spain. So suppose that Spain had been totally leveled, everything destroyed by a huge superpower, which was gloating in it. They could read the military journals, public journals of this superpower while when they'd gotten to the time when they destroyed everything in Spain, there was nothing left. They sent the Air Force to destroy the dams. Let's imagine there are huge dams that control the water supply. So they destroyed the dams, which is, of course, a war crime for which people were hanged at Nuremberg. But destroyed the dams, and then talking just very excitedly about how wonderful it was to see the water pouring down and digging out the valleys, and the Asians scurrying around trying to survive. We can't even imagine what this means to Asians. It means destruction of their rice crop, starvation and death. So it's really magnificent. It's not in our memory, but it's in their memory. And let's go to the present. And there's an interesting recent history. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were moving towards an agreement in which North Korea would stop sending any missiles or any high technology to the Middle East, and Israel would recognize North Korea. Clinton intervened and blocked it. Shortly after that, in retaliation, North Korea carried out a minor missile test. The U.S. and North Korea did reach an agreement, framework agreement, 1994, and it was more or less honored by both sides, not completely, but pretty much. When George Bush came into office, North Korea had maybe one nuclear weapon and verifiably wasn't producing any more. Maybe it didn't even have any. Well, Bush immediately launched his aggressive militarism, threatening North Korea, acts of evil and so on. So they got back to work on their nuclear program. By the time Bush left, they had 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and a missile system. In between, other things happened. In 2005, the U.S. and North Korea did reach an agreement. It was an agreement in which North Korea agreed to put an end to all nuclear weapons and missile development. In return, the U.S. and the West, but mainly the U.S., would provide a light water reactor for their medical needs and end aggressive statements. They'd form a non-aggression pact and move towards some kind of accommodation. Well, it's pretty promising, except almost immediately Bush undermined it. He withdrew the offer of the light water reactor and initiated programs to compel banks to stop dealing with any North Korean transactions, even perfectly legal ones. So North Koreans reacted by picking up their missile and weapons program. And that's pretty much the way it's been going. And it's well known to scholarship. So you can read it in straight mainstream American scholarship. What they say is, look, it's a pretty crazy regime, but they're following a kind of a tit-for-tat policy. You do something, make a hostile gesture, we'll respond with some crazy gesture. Well, what's happening right now? There are South Korean U.S. Military exercises, which, from North Korea's point of view, got to look threatening. We'd think they were threatening if they're going on in Canada, let's say. And in the course of these, the most advanced bombers in the world in history, stealth B-2s and B-52s, are carrying out simulated nuclear bombing attacks right on North Korea's borders. They remember something from the past. So they're reacting in a very aggressive, extreme way. Well, what comes to the West from all of this is how crazy the North Koreans are. Yeah, they are, but there's a little bit more to say. Well, this is the way the world is going. I don't have to talk about Spain. I mean, Spain is being devastated by economic policies which are totally mad. I mean, it's perfectly obvious that you can't first of all, the Spanish problem was not what Spain was doing. Their budget was pretty much balanced in 2007. It's banks, which includes German banks because they do the lending. So the banks went crazy with the boom, and when everything busted, the population pays for it. Actually, I was just in Ireland, same story. The big Celtic boom, they called it, all bank shenanigans. It crashed. The government guaranteed all the losses of the banks. Government means the population, so the population pays off the banks, and they're doing fine, and meanwhile the population's suffering. Then the Troika comes in and says you have to carry out policies that are going to make it worse. Austerity under stagnation, that's no way to grow out of it. Well, this is not a problem at the scale of destruction of of existence, but it's a serious one. And these things, it's not that there are no alternatives. Sure, there are alternatives, but they're not being taken, and that's dangerous. So if you ask what the world is going to look like, it's not a pretty picture. Unless people do something about it, we always can. Easy to paint a pretty picture, and maybe it's worth thinking about. Actually, one way in which the future could be is actually suggested by Barcelona. In 1936, there was some very significant developments took place in Spain. Not for the first time. They have a long history. They didn't come out of nowhere. There've been years and years of thinking about it, working about it, experimentation, efforts that were crushed. But
you have a phone to do?
Yeah, I'll be in a second. But and it was a complicated development. First, it was in the middle of a war. So, but until there was a social revolution, it was crushed within about a year. But during that 1 year, and it's crushed incidentally by the communists, the fascists, and the liberal democracies operating together. They didn't want it, but ended up in May Day in Barcelona and went on. But there was a development of self-governing, autonomous, free communities of a pretty impressive kind. There's some interesting literature about it. Interesting book called Of Collectivizations, just statements by small communities about what they were doing, which is very moving. I remember one by, I read these things when I was a kid, when a town called Membria, I don't even know if it's still there, but it described what they were doing and said, Membria may be the poorest town in Spain, but it is the most just, and they described what they were doing. And there were a lot of potential there in Barcelona, too. It was crushed, but it was a potential. And I think it gives a fleeting image of what a more free and just society could be like. And I think that's the kind of thing that's within reach. In the United States, for example, which is, right in Spain, for example, in the Basque Country, the Mondragon conglomerate is an indication of steps that can be taken towards a more free and democratic society. And make a lot of criticisms, but it's an important step. The Mondragon is now, there's some linkage being set up between Mondragon and the U.S. Steelworkers Union. It's one of the most progressive unions to work together on developing worker-owned enterprises and cooperatives in the Rust Belt, the area of the United States where the manufacturing industry has been destroyed by policies that were by no means necessary. And there are worker-owned enterprises developing, and these are steps towards a more free and just future, and there's many others that can be taken. But we're not going to get there unless we pay some serious attention to major problems, major threats that we face.